Around 7 p.m. on Saturday, August 13th, 2011, 19-year-old Wang Weijie was with his friends Ma Jun and Zhou Guo at an internet cafe in the city of Taiping, China, watching Jun play a computer game. Now, Weijie and his friends went to this cafe a lot, and today they had literally been there for hours by this point. But now, as Jun finished up the game he was playing, Guo announced that he was actually ready to go do something else now. So the three of these guys spent a lot of time together, whether it was at an internet cafe or elsewhere. They were like really close friends. And generally speaking, Weijie usually just did whatever Jun and Guo wanted to do, since they both had strong opinions, and Weijie was more of a go-with-the-flow type of guy. And so now, as Guo decided they were done with games, Weijie was just like, all right, cool. Well, why don't we just head back to one of our places just to hang out? But Guo, he shook his head and said, no way, like it's Saturday. They didn't have to be up for school the next day, and so they could stay out all night if they wanted to. And so he said, like, we gotta find something really exciting to do. Like, we gotta make the most of this night. Now, nobody had like a great idea of what was gonna be super exciting. And so Guo was like, all right, well, for now, like, let's just go outside and we can smoke first, and then we can go from there. And at this, both Jun and Weijie just nodded in agreement, like, okay, that's the plan. But in reality, Weijie wasn't really sure if he felt comfortable staying out all night tonight, because tonight was not just a normal night. Like, this was an iffy night to stay out all night. So this particular weekend was not just an ordinary weekend. It was actually the area's annual Ghost Festival, a time on the lunar calendar when ghosts apparently would wander the streets after dark. And Weijie's family, along with his friends' families, and frankly, a lot of other people in this area, they took this festival really seriously. They believed the ghosts really were out wandering the streets after dark because they were just very superstitious. In fact, in this area, this festival was taken so seriously that businesses would often close early so people could safely make their way home before nightfall. Now, Weijie himself didn't really necessarily believe in ghosts, despite his family appearing to very much believe in them. But the reality is Weijie was just not a guy who ruffled feathers. He went with the flow. He was a rule follower. So in his mind, he was thinking, it's the Ghost Festival. Kind of don't want to stay out late tonight. But now, Guo was already making his way towards the exit with Jun, and so Weijie didn't bother to argue. Instead, he just followed right along and they went outside to smoke. About an hour later, Weijie was sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with Jun behind the wheel and Guo in the back, and they were driving down a road in the outskirts of town. And by this point, the sun had set, and so now they were officially in Ghost Festival territory. Like, presumably there are ghosts out now out on the roads. So after leaving the internet cafe, the three of them, they had a smoke, but then as they're out there, they couldn't come up with a compelling idea for how to spend the rest of their big night out. All they came up with is, let's just like get in the car and drive around and maybe we'll figure out something to do. Now, initially, when they hopped in the car, they're thinking, okay, like it's getting dark out, like we're gonna be driving around during the Ghost Festival, we're bound to find something exciting to do. And so all of them are like, they're amped up, they're in the car, they're pumped, we're gonna find something fun. But after a while, they were just randomly driving around. No one's really out because, again, it's this Ghost Festival. Everybody's, in their homes. There's nothing going on. And it just became really, really boring. They're just like driving around and nothing's going on. And so at a certain point, Weijie is just feeling so frustrated because it's like he didn't want to be out here in the first place. He didn't voice that to his friends, but like he didn't want to be out here. He just wanted to be home. And so he just was like, man, like, this is so boring. And he just leaned his head up against the window and just decided to drift off to sleep. And so he's like closing his eyes and he's just laying there, and Jun, who's driving, is just, driving along. They're not really talking. And so Weijie, as he's laying there, he suddenly feels the car come to a screeching stop. And Guo in the back seat immediately, reflexively screams at Jun, the driver, like, hey, what are you doing? Drive more carefully. And Weijie, he's like looking around like, what just happened? And he looks over at Jun, who's driving, and Jun is not paying any attention to Guo or to Weijie. He's just pointing out the windshield at something on the road, and he's like, look! And so Weijie, who's just sort of confused because a moment ago he was half asleep, he looks from Jun out the front windshield to see what he's pointing at, and there's this woman who's just sitting in the middle of the road. They're out on the outskirts of town. Like, there's no really any buildings around or anything. Like, they're out in the sticks. and it's dark out, and everyone's home for the Ghost Festival, and there's just this woman sitting on the ground. She's wearing this floral dress, and there's a bike that she has that's next to her, just propped up. And she's almost been hit by a car. Like, they stopped very close to her. She's almost been hit by a car, and she's just sitting there staring blankly at the car. And so June, he's pointing at her like he can't believe it. He almost hit her, and Wei just like, what's going on? And Guo, like, he doesn't even know what to make of it. And at some point, June sort of snaps out of it, and he leans out the window and he yells at the woman to like, get out of the way. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out of the road. But the woman didn't budge. She just sat there staring at them, just on the ground, not a care in the world, just looking right at all three of them. And so eventually, after sort of the tension in the car went down a little bit, June just pulled his head back in the window and he looked at his friends and he's like, I don't know. And he just drove around this woman, just avoided her, and they continued driving along. For the next few hours, the three boys just continued driving around town, looking for something to do, but there still was nothing to do. Everything's basically abandoned because it's this Ghost Festival night. Nobody's out, no businesses are open, there's nothing to do. And what really had not left any of their minds, even though they really didn't talk about it, was that woman. Like, that was so unusual to just see her sitting there, not reacting to nearly being hit. Like, the whole thing was just so creepy, made more so because it's the night of this Ghost Festival. Like, talk about the creepiest night to see something like that. And so eventually, around like 1 a.m., when the boys are still just driving around, someone in the car suggests like, hey, let's go back to that intersection and see if she's still there. Like, let's just see what she's doing. Now, keep in mind, it's been hours since they've seen this woman, like hours. And so they drive back around, not really expecting to see her there. They think that, like, no matter how weird that was, she has to have gotten up and left by now. But no, they turn onto that road, which again is outside of the town. It's like there's no buildings around, it's dark minus their headlights. And they drive down this road, and sure enough, off in the distance, still sitting in this intersection, is this woman. She's unmoved. She's just sitting there in her dress with a bike next to her, just hours later, no change. And so now it's like the boys can't help but feel really uneasy here. Like, this isn't right. Something's wrong with this woman. I mean, also they can't help but think like, it's the night of the Ghost Festival. Are we seeing a ghost? Like, they're terrified. I mean, that's the reality, is they were scared. But really, more than anything, what all three of them are thinking and discussing in the car is, we gotta tell someone about her. Like, there's something wrong with this woman. What is she doing? Is she mentally unwell? Is she on drugs? We don't know, but like, this isn't okay. We gotta tell someone. But for now, the three boys decided that they had had enough fun for one night, and they drove to June's house, and they just all crashed there, determined to figure out what to do with this woman and what they saw the next day. And so several hours later, the boys wake up, they make their way into the kitchen because they can hear June's mom is in there making breakfast. And right away, June tells his mom what happened the night before. And as he's regaling her in the details of the story, June and Guo also chimed in with their perspective. And then after they were done telling June's mom, they all sort of expected her, being an authority figure, to know what to do. That she would very likely say, okay, we need to call the police, or we need to call a hospital, or we need to call some other authority figure and handle this professionally. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she just kind of looked at the boys and she said, you saw a ghost. On the night of August 28, 2004, a 21-year-old named John Hutcherson leaned over a bar in Marietta, Georgia, and asked the bartender for another beer. John, by this point, had completely lost track of how many drinks he had had in the past few hours, but he was sure it had been a lot, because by this point, the room was starting to spin. However, he had no plans to stop drinking anytime soon. After all, it was only midnight, which was very early for John, and he was having a great time, and the bar was packed, and there was loud music playing, and John was also on a winning streak, playing pool. And so while he waited for his beer, John looked over at the pool table. He had left his best friend Frankie there a few minutes ago, but now, as he was looking over there, he didn't see Frankie anymore. So John and Frankie had been very close ever since high school, and this night out they were having was sort of like a typical Saturday for them. Every week they would meet at this bar, they would get exceptionally drunk, and they would basically stay out all night. But on this night, they were both a lot drunker than usual, and now Frankie was gone. And so as John, very drunkenly, looked around the bar to see if he could find Frankie, he noticed a girl he didn't recognize at the end of the bar. She was very cute, and she appeared to be smiling at him. And so, John sees her and forgets all about his friend Frankie being gone and just smiles back at this girl. And then a moment later, the bartender hands him his beer, and John's feeling really confident. He takes his beer and he begins walking towards this girl. However, before he actually reached her, he felt a hand on his arm, and he turned to see Frankie, who looked just awful. He looked so pale, he smelled like vomit. And Frankie told John, as well as he could, because he's so drunk, he's mumbling everything. He just said he felt horrible and it was time to go. Now, John was really disappointed because even though he was really, really drunk too, he wasn't as bad as Frankie. Like, John had not reached the nauseous and vomiting phase of extreme intoxication. And so he's thinking, man, there are a couple more hours till closing and I really want to talk to this girl. But he was Frankie's ride, and Frankie had to go home, clearly, and so if he was going home, John had to go home too. So John just chugged his beer, put it back on the bar, and then he turned and kind of waved at the girl, being like, sorry, I gotta go. And then John pulled his car keys out of his pocket. And so John and Frankie, they head outside to the parking lot, and John goes to his truck, and he climbs into the driver's seat. And as he's fumbling with the keys to start the car, Frankie had gone around to the other side and stumbled his way into the passenger seat. And even though he's wrecked drunk, he's totally out of it, Frankie looks over at John and sees him unable to even start the car. And he's like, hey, are you sure you're good to drive? And John looks over at Frankie and he's like, of course, I'm just fine. I do this every single week. We always get home safe. And so at this point, Frankie's like, all right, whatever, let's just go. And so John, he eventually manages to turn the car on. He throws it in gear. And he began to pull out of the parking lot onto the road, but as he did, he really had to squint his eyes just to see the road clearly. His whole world is totally spinning because of how intoxicated he was. And then as soon as he actually began driving down the main road on the way home, the first thing he did is he's hitting the curb and swerving back onto the road, but he was, basically steady. He's totally wasted, but he's basically hanging on. And then the rest of the drive was just a blur. John was white knuckling it the rest of the way, He's driving along, he sees the gas station that he always passed on the way home, so that's a familiar landmark, he's going the right way. He eventually passes a familiar billboard, but then at some point his eyes snap back into focus because he realizes he's swerving off the road onto the shoulder, but he swerves back just in time to avoid hitting a telephone pole. And he's like, oh man, I got this, stay focused. And then somehow, some way, eventually he winds up in front of Frankie's house. And so he drops his friend off, and then back on the road he goes, navigating now at this point, with one eye shut. And he eventually finds his way to his parents' house where he was staying. And from there, he climbed out of his car, he walked up the driveway, he unlocked the front door, and then stumbled up to his room where he immediately just fell into his bed and passed out. The next thing John knew, he heard voices, and then he felt somebody grab his arm and shake him. And then when he opened his eyes, his vision was very blurry, but eventually it came into focus and he saw that he was clearly in his bedroom, in his bed, on top of his blankets, but he had no idea how he got there. He looked down and noticed he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they were sticky and they were dirty. And then there were also these two figures who were standing over him, repeating his name over and over again, almost angrily. John looked at these two and didn't really know who they were, but then he noticed they were both wearing matching uniforms. They were police officers. And these officers were very angrily asking John, what happened last night? What did you do? What happened the night before? But John, he still is sort of trying to figure out what's even going on. He really doesn't have a good memory of anything that happened the night before. All he can just quickly remember is he was at that bar, he saw that girl, he drove Frankie home, he knew he was drunk on the ride home, but he got home. He didn't know what else they were trying to figure out about what happened the night before. And so when he finally opened his mouth to be like, what is going on? Because he was still basically drunk, it just came out of his mouth like this incoherent babbling. He was like, what's going on here? And the two officers, they were just over it, and they just grabbed John and literally pulled him out of the bed. They whipped his hands behind his back, they handcuffed him, and John, who's like, what is happening? They lead him out of his bedroom, downstairs, past his mom and dad, who are staring at him like, what is going on? And even though John, again, is basically like borderline incoherent, in passing by his parents, he's hoping they're gonna be like, hey, officers, why are you arresting my son? But instead, as he's led past them, he looks at his mom and dad, and they're not about to put up some fight. They're crying. They're holding each other and crying. Like they clearly know something bad has happened and they can't stop what's happening to their son. And so the officers, they walk John in handcuffs out the front door, and they walk him over to his truck in the driveway. And when they got there, the officers just stopped and gestured for John to have a look inside. And so John, he's sort of looking at the officers like, okay, what's going on with my truck? And he turned and he just sort of squinted and looked through the window into the car. And there was this large object in the passenger seat that he didn't remember being there the night before. Then as he looked more closely, he realized with horror what it was. So the night before, John did drive when he absolutely should not have. He was clearly way past the legal limit for driving. He should never have been driving, totally unsafe for others, for him. Shouldn't have happened, but he did. He drove. And so he and Frankie, they're driving home, and John, in his limited memory, recalled, this sort of like blurry ride home, where basically as dangerous as it was, he got them home. But at one point, he remembered almost hitting a telephone pole, and he swerved just in time, and he narrowly avoided it. And in some ways that was true. He did avoid smashing into the telephone pole, but he didn't avoid an incident. So Frankie, because he was so nauseous from having drank too much, he had his head out the window as they were driving along trying to get some fresh air. And when John drove too close to that telephone pole and swerved at the last second, Frankie's head was still out the window, and his head was decapitated by one of the tension wires coming off the pole. The tight wire that holds that pole into the ground, one of them, it's like a guillotine, and they're speeding past it, and Frankie's neck hit the wire, off went his head. But his body remained in the passenger seat of the car, and John was so belligerently drunk that he didn't see he had just killed his friend, nor did he see his friend's body, or a part of his body, still in his car. And so when John drunkenly arrived at Frankie's house, and he's like, all right, bye, he thought maybe Frankie got out of the car, but clearly he didn't. He was just there, dead, in his passenger seat. And then John just drove back to his parents' house and just left the car in the driveway with his friend's body inside, and up to his bedroom he went and passed out, having no idea what he had just done. A few months later, John would plead guilty to vehicular homicide, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, at first, all three boys were just shocked at how confidently and calmly she said this. I mean, of course they knew about the annual Ghost Festival, and of course, people in this town were very superstitious, including their own families. They knew this meant a lot, this festival. But the idea that we're gonna sit here and literally say that the woman we saw sitting on the ground last night was a literal ghost, that seemed crazy. And the boys began saying as much to June's mom. But June's mom was just really annoyed with them and just basically shot them down and said, look, you saw a ghost, but that's the reason you're not supposed to be out on the night of the annual Ghost Festival. It's why the business is shut down. It's why we all go home before nightfall. You knew you weren't supposed to be out at night. You were. That's why this happened. Not to mention, these ghosts, they don't just wander around. They target people. You were targeted. Now, June's mother was not just throwing that out there. She was referencing one other aspect of this annual Ghost Festival that lots of people in this area believed, which was these ghosts that wandered around after dark on this one night of the year, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for people to effectively latch onto. And so part of the reason people believed you need to stay in at night and avoid being out after dark is because if you basically interact with one of these ghosts, they could latch onto you and then you become its target. In some cases, people believe it just produces really bad luck for you for potentially months at a stretch. Some other people say that once you've been targeted by one of these ghosts, they may try to kill you. Specifically, they may try to drown you. And so no one really knew, but it was like this belief that you just never want to interact with a ghost because it could be very bad for you. And so June and Guo, they still tried to argue a little with June's mother, trying to tell her that no, this could not possibly be a ghost, but their voices seemed less forceful now, and Weijia, like he was sitting there thinking like, actually, if that was a ghost, this kind of makes sense. It explains why she didn't react at all to nearly being hit by a car. She just sat there. Also, why is she just sitting there? Strange activity for anybody to be doing. Maybe a ghost would do that. It also kind of explains why she was still there hours and hours later, just sitting in the middle of the road. Like other cars must have gone by. Like this is not normal behavior. And so Wade just thinking, wait a minute, maybe this was a ghost. However, just as Weijia really started to feel almost sick with worry about, the seriousness of what had happened, he heard Jun's mom tell them, don't be afraid. She said, look, I know exactly what you need to do to stay safe. Later that same day, Weijia parked his car at a cemetery that was near Jun's house. And after he parked, he and Jun got out while Guo stayed behind in the car. All three of them were very tense. They were very anxious. And as Weijia scanned the headstones and looked over at a cornfield that was next to the cemetery, all he was thinking is this ghost woman is gonna appear at any moment and she's gonna do something to us. But she didn't. And so eventually, Weijia and Jun began walking down the path that would lead them through all the gravestones, basically deeper into the cemetery. So the reason these two were here and now walking into the cemetery is because they were following Jun's mother's advice for how to stay safe now that they had potentially come in contact with this ghost. And so they had gone out and acquired a stack of ghost money, and now they were going to go spend it. So ghost money is a kind of paper sheet in China that typically is burned when a loved one dies. The idea is when you burn this money, it sort of goes to the deceased loved one, and then they have money for the afterlife. You're basically giving your deceased loved one currency for the afterlife. But it can also be a way to buy protection from angry spirits. So Weijia and his friends have been told to burn ghost money over their family grave plots so that their dead ancestors could essentially pay the ghost, the evil ghost, to leave them alone. Now, they'd already done this at Guo's family plot in a separate cemetery, so that's why Guo was staying back in the car, and now they were going to do Jun's family plot in this cemetery. And so Weijia and Jun, they continue walking through the cemetery until finally they reach some of Jun's ancestors' graves. There, they knelt down, they pulled out their ghost money, and they began to burn the bills. And they're both just kneeling there, burning this money. And with each, bill that crumpled up and smoldered, both of them were feeling like this enormous wave of relief coming over them. And so for a little while, they're just burning their money, and they're both looking down at the money on the ground. They're just kneeling there. But then at some point, Weijia just looked up. And as soon as he did, he froze. Because standing right behind Jun can't see this, right behind Jun is that woman in a dress. And she's looking at both of them. And Weijia was so scared, he shrieked, he jumped up, turned, and started running in the opposite direction. Now Jun is so startled by Weijia screaming that he jumped up, ready to run away himself, but he's watching Weijia take off, and he turns around because he could tell Weijia saw something behind him, but there's nothing behind him. And he's thinking he must have seen the ghost, because why else would he react this way? But there's nobody here. And so Jun sort of put together, like, what's going on here? Like, Weijia clearly spooked himself. We're in a cemetery after all. And he sees Weijia, and he's running, and he disappears into the cornfield that was next to the cemetery. He's just gone, just running, he's gone. Now, this cornfield was pretty massive. It had not been harvested, so the stalks were really tall. And clearly, like, Weijia was on a mission, and so Jun was not about to just chase after him. Instead, he ran back to the car and he grabbed Guo first, and the two of them went after Weijia. However, when they got to the cornfield and actually went inside of it, they quickly realized it was going to be really hard to find anything in this cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so thick and tall, it's so dense. I mean, every step was so slow and difficult, and they're calling out for Weijia, but there's no response. And so after several minutes of only moving, like 10, 15 feet or so into this cornfield, making no progress, the two of them are like, what happened to him? Like, either the ghost got him, or like maybe he's in hiding somewhere. Maybe he's convinced that the ghost is nearby and he's just being quiet and he's in hiding and he's somewhere in this cornfield, but we gotta find him. And so the two friends, they back out of the cornfield and they end up calling a bunch of their friends to meet them at this cornfield and help them look for Weijia. So all these friends, they eventually arrive, And all day and into the night, these friends search this cornfield. They're looking everywhere for Weijia. Everyone's screaming his name, but there's no sign of him. 3 days later, and Weijia still had not been found. Now, by this point, Weijia's parents had been told. They had told police. Police had looked for Weijia, but there was no sign of him. I mean, they were still out looking for him, but right now, like, the talk of the town was, where is Weijia? Nobody knew. And so on this day, 3 days after the day that Weijia went missing, Jun was sitting in his room just feeling miserable. All he can think about is his friend and what happened to him. Like, he ran off after presumably seeing this ghost. Like, did the ghost get him? Like, all these horrible thoughts are going through his head. And Jun, as he's sitting in his room, he hears his mom call out to him, telling him there's a visitor. And so Jun, he gets up, he leaves his room, he goes to the front of the house, and he sees a police officer standing in the doorway. And this officer would tell Jun and his mother that they had found Weijia, and he was dead. His body was found in a lake that was not far from the cemetery, and that he had drowned. Jun is completely shocked. I mean, on the one hand, he sort of was expecting bad news at this point. I mean, basically everybody was. But to hear that his friend was dead was just horrific, and he really struggled to keep back tears. But, before he could really even react to this, the officer went on to say that, Jun, we spoke to Weijia's parents, and they told us that you and Guo were with their son last, that you were with him before he vanished. And so we just want you to tell us, now that we know he passed away, that he drowned, we want to know what happened. What did you see? Like, what led to him drowning? And Jun, he just launched into the most detailed version of the story he could possibly think of. He took the officer all the way back to them at the internet cafe, playing computer games. They decide they're gonna stay out all night. They go outside, they're having a smoke, they're talking about what they're gonna do. They decide they're gonna get in the car and just drive around. They're driving around on the night of this ghost festival. They see this woman, they think it's a ghost. Like, he went through this whole rendition of the ghost being really central to this story, and how the next day Jun's mom had said, oh, go burn ghost money in the cemetery to protect yourself from the spirits. They go to the cemetery and they're burning the ghost money, but then Weijia, he gets so scared. Jun's convinced it's because he sees the ghost again, this woman, and he takes off running into the cornfield. So he tells the officer every little detail. And he knew that even in a place like this, where people did, for the most part, believe in ghosts, he knew his story really hinged on a ghost made Weijia do this. And he knew that it was totally preposterous in some ways, but he thinks he's telling him the truth. And so he tells the officer all this stuff. And the officer's just staring at him, and he's clearly very skeptical. And then at some point, after Jun is done, and he's just waiting for the officer looks at him, and he asks him one question that once he answers honestly, it completely explains everything that happened. It would turn out that woman who was sitting in the middle of the road that sort of became the centerpiece of this whole ordeal was not a ghost. In fact, she wasn't even real. Because the three friends, Jun, Guo, and Weijia, on the night they decide to have their big night, they're going to stay out all night. When they went out for a smoke, they didn't smoke cigarettes. They smoked methamphetamine, which can cause you to hallucinate. And so they were high on meth driving around and hallucinated that woman. But they all, believed they saw it, and it felt so real, and it was on the same night as this annual ghost festival that it felt so real that even the next day, when they were no longer high, they still believed they had seen it. And then Jun's mom confirmed, yep, that was a ghost, because she believes in ghosts. And so they set out to the cemetery, and they're gonna burn this ghost money to save themselves from these evil spirits. And what do before they head out to the cemetery? They smoke more meth. And Weijia, he has another hallucination. He thinks he sees the ghost, ran into the cornfield, not realizing that deep in the cornfield was a lake. He fell into it, and he was high on meth and didn't know how to swim, and so he drowned. On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her and also sort of scary. And it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window. And it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in, giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy. Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly, and they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice. He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her. And so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture, and she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet, and, she pet him for a second, and then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying, and for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored, and that was her parrot's drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Polly regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Polly did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Polly pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance. Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, I mean, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing. She was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions, like the dream she had just had, about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She'd planned this whole trip, she'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend Tim, and also she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital, but lately they'd been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her, like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal lives and work on their issues, but in a happy sort of fun environment. It felt like they needed it for their relationship. But now Linda knew she would not only have to break the news to Tim that they were going to go ahead and cancel this trip, but also she would need to go find something else, some other way for her and Tim to reconcile, call it a different vacation or some other outing or something to like break the norm, which had become sort of toxic. So on this night, eventually Linda calmed down from the shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare, and She laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. Like, this was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't gonna die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda stormed down the hallway of the hospital where she worked towards her office. Linda was fuming. So she should have been leaving for her trip to the Caribbean with Tim in just a few days, but she had gone ahead and canceled the cruise because of her dream, which Tim was very annoyed with her about. He'd been vocal about the fact that her reason for canceling this trip was ridiculous, and it had made things really tense between them, and it was already tense between them, so this is like doubly bad. And now, just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together, and they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. Like, she knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. Like, she had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. Two things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits. Even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim, they were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, like, the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here, because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend, but she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds, because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning the premonition she had was right. She did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011.